what are the craziest stories or scenes that have unfolded at the funerals you've been at as a funeral director?
One of the family members kind of pulled me aside away from the rest of the family and said, hey, listen, we have someone that we don't want coming to the funeral home.
Did she show up?
She did show up.
Have you buried anyone you went to high school with? And if so, what was that like?
I start to unzip the bag and I take a look at this person. I'm like, I went to high school with this person.
All right. We're going to get to all of that in just a moment. But first, I want you to know how grateful I am for today's podcast sponsor, my friends at FitAF Nutrition. They are Eastern Pennsylvania's leading meal prep company. FitAF offers meals of multiple sizes for people with various health goals. And you know what I love about this company? They use high-quality ingredients like grass-fed meats, wild fish, and locally harvested produce. And all right, for you parents on the go, they even offer family meals. Go to fitafnutrition.com, place your order by Thursday at midnight, and get fresh, prepared meals delivered right to your door on Sunday. Use code RLECKY at checkout and get 20% off your first order.
Here we go, buddy.
It's the Ryan Leckey Show.
Welcome back to another episode. So glad to have you here. You know, today's topic is something interesting we really wanted to take a deep dive on for quite some time. Funerals, but really the business of funerals. And being a funeral director, they are sometimes the most awkward moments for families, the hardest times for people. Sometimes you don't know what to say at a funeral, but we really wanted to dive in on some of the craziest untold stories of the funeral home business. I mean, there's been television shows surrounding this topic, so we had to bring in somebody who has 3 decades of experience as a funeral director in northeastern Pennsylvania, Vince Maletta. Are you ready for this?
Yeah, pretty much.
All right, so when I heard you were a funeral director, I'm like, well, what does a funeral director do? First, we got to know that title because you have some insane stories that we got to get to.
Right, absolutely. So basically the role of a funeral director is, we're dealing with folks at their worst. So the way I look at it is we're there to counsel and to guide people through the process of death. Okay, so again, these folks are at their worst. They've had perhaps the death of a grandmother, a son, a daughter. Obviously, those are more traumatic than, those that perhaps have been in a nursing home for a while and have been struggling with ailments and diseases. But our job is to guide folks through that entire process. And I think we take it in sort of stepwise. So a lot of the things that I like to do is I like to get to know a little bit about the person, because it's important that we personalize the funeral service for the individual and for the family so that we can represent exactly what that person was like during their life. And so I think guiding folks through that process is an important piece of that. Now, we have obviously state required documents that need to be filled out. We have obituaries that need to be filled out. So that's a lot of background information that we have to gather from families. So what I like to do is I like to sit down with folks and sort of stepwise it for them so that they understand that this is a process and we're going to take it in small chunks. Again, they're at their worst. So we want to guide them slowly through the process.
All right, so we're going to get to some of the juicy stuff and the interesting questions. Even my team was like, does this really happen? But how did you even get into this business? I mean, you've been doing it now for more than 30 years. What kind of sparked your interest to say, all right, I kind of want to dive into this as a career?
So I'd gone to the University of Scranton, and I was a political science major, which doesn't lead into becoming a funeral director, but I had thought about a career in law. And when I really started to talk to some of my friends that were attorneys, and I had interned a bit at the Lackawanna County District Attorney's Office, I thought to myself, this is kind of boring work. And I always had a passion for the human body, for physiology and for biology. So I had met with a couple of my dear friends that were funeral directors, one of which was a descendant of the same town in Italy that my parents were from. So we had a lot of common friends, and we had a lot of common interests. So I remember probably back in 1992, sitting down with him. I was a senior at the University of Scranton, struggling with what's that next step for me. So I sat down with him on the porch of his funeral home and had a candid conversation with him about what exactly is involved in being a funeral director. And the great thing about our conversation was he gave me the good, the bad and the ugly. So I went home, had a chat with my parents, and thought about it long and hard, and thought, this is a way for me to give back to people and a way for me to help people at their worst, and also involve that piece of the human body and science and physiology that I had a great interest in. And I applied to mortuary school, was accepted, and I did 2 years in Simmons Institute of Mortuary Science in Syracuse, New York.
And what happens at the school? What do you learn to do?
So the school, just a little bit of a background. In Pennsylvania, you have to have a 2-year associate's degree. I had finished my studies at the University of Scranton, so for me it was a natural just progression to mortuary school. So essentially they break it up in a couple of different ways, because let's think about owning a funeral home or being a funeral director. There's a business aspect to it, naturally. And so there were business courses, there were psychology courses, grief counseling courses, and then what everybody thinks about is the embalming, or that part of preparing the human remains. So there were some physiology courses, some biology courses, and then of course there was a practical piece to it, which was there were groups of students in the school that were on call. So the school had a what we call trade embalming service. So for funeral directors that don't want to do their own embalming, the school would provide that service. So it's sort of a give and take, where the students would get that practical background, and it would give back to the community a little bit and help funeral directors in that process. So we would be on call, we would carry a pager, which obviously you don't know. Today, you talk about pagers.
Oh, I had a pager back in the day.
Right. So now it's all cell phones, it's all apps. So back then we actually had pagers. So we were on call. The student or the teacher instructor would get a page from a funeral home. They would go to a local hospital, nursing home, or family home, retrieve the deceased, and bring the deceased back to the school, where we had a morgue or an embalming room set up. And the students would be able to be involved in that part of the process. So we would see all of the different pieces to the embalming process and the preparation of the deceased. And that was a great part to, before we would go out and pursue our careers and look for jobs, we would have that practical piece of the education.
So you mentioned obviously they have the business component, the grief counseling, but I think the biggest thing is, how do you get used to working around dead people?
Well, I think obviously, like any career, if it's something you're interested in and you explore it, you have to have that mental fortitude and sort of that, what I like to call transference. So you have to kind of treat it as work, because if you let that emotional piece get involved in it, you kind of get lost in that. And then we lose that piece of being a counselor and guiding people through the process. So you really kind of, I don't want to sound callous, but you sort of get used to being that individual who's helping that person through the process. And obviously there's traumatic deaths, there's children, there's younger folks that pass away, some from suicide or overdose perhaps. Those are the tougher ones, but again, our role is there to help and to guide people through that process. And you want to put that best, so that those remains or that individual is part of our product. So making sure that that person looks as best as possible, and a lot of times we ask for photographs from family members so that we can give them that best depiction, so that they have that last memory of that person, should they choose to have a visitation where the casket's open, is a pleasant one, and one that they take through the rest of their life. Because the dying process is not pleasant. Whether it's an individual who's in a nursing home for 5 or 6 years, or someone who left in the morning and said, hey, Mom, I'll see you after work, and they never return home. So giving that family that last final viewing or that last memory of that person is something we take very, very seriously.
This might be a little gruesome, but after being in the business for 30 years, has the technology or the chemicals and the materials used to embalm somebody, has it evolved? Has it changed to preserve a body a lot longer?
That stayed pretty and true for many, many years. So there's formaldehyde and there's glutaraldehyde. So one has a more preserving feature to it. The other sort of maybe makes them look a little bit more natural and isn't as, quote, potent. And it isn't like fitness, like, where supplements change with body composition. It's pretty much stayed pretty true. But again, just kind of like finite, changes maybe, but nothing really serious to help the process.
Why do you think funerals are so awkward for people? Obviously, it's an emotional toll on the people impacted, but people going to viewings and funerals, I've been to a number of viewings. Every time it kind of creeps you out because you're like, oh my gosh, what do I say? Like I hear people, they walk up to the casket, oh, he looks good. She looks good.
Right.
Like,
and what else are you going to say? And I think an important piece of that is it's not something we do every day. Think about the job you do. I think about the job that I do every single day. I'm comfortable, I'm at ease with it, and I know what to do, number one. And the second piece of it is I know what to expect. And I think what happens with folks that go to viewings and to funerals is they don't know what to expect. They don't know how emotional the family's going to be. They don't know what to say. So I think what people need to realize is whatever feeling you're having, have that feeling, go in there and just say what naturally comes to you and just try to be a source of comfort for the family and just take things as they come. We all put this expectation on what it's going to be. Like today coming in here, I've never done a podcast before, so I really didn't know what to expect. And in the beginning, I was a little nervous, but now it's just like, okay, I'm settled in and I'm feeling it and I'm just letting the surroundings. A lot of it is energy. We don't talk enough about energy, even in the funeral business. Like, you walk into the funeral home and it's like, okay, it's dark, there's heavy drapes, there's leather chairs. It's like, oh my God. But just like let it take you over and just kind of become a part of it. And you'll find that you're going to leave and say, yeah, that wasn't so bad. And people and families appreciate folks that show up for them and express their condolences in a natural way and able to share that moment with them. And I think it's important for people to do that.
and before we get to the crazy stuff, though, what are some of the best things to say at a viewing or a funeral? Like, if you're like, oh my gosh, you walk in and a lot of people, as you said, because they don't do this all the time,
right,
feel like a fish out of water. Like, what do you say if you're like, okay, I need a line?
So I think what is important is in the moment, because I can come here and say, hey, how you doing? How you doing today? So let's think about that statement. It's a different feel now. I'm not asking you how you're doing in general, because you could tell me something about something that happened 3 weeks ago. How you doing today? Like, how you doing right now? Are you okay? And then I think what's really comforting for families, and I know my dad has passed away now a little over 11 years, and I still hear people come up to me and tell me stories. So that's like, think about it as you're driving to the viewing. Think about a story that you remember, which is a pleasant experience or a pleasant story about the deceased, and share that with the family. Because guess what? It might be something they never knew about that person. Like if it's someone that worked with the deceased and they sang on the way to work. I don't ever remember my dad singing, or something like that. You know, it's just, you know, express your care and concern, but then a really cool story about the person that family member can then take with them.
And you've been a funeral director for multiple funeral homes, I want to say in northeastern Pennsylvania, over the years.
Over the years. So it's just, I finished mortuary school in 1994, so it's hard to imagine it's been 30 years. And I've been associated with a number of funeral homes in and around Lackawanna County because, again, it takes a village per se, so we kind of help each other out. And since 2007, I've been associated with the Michael P. Glinski Funeral Home in Oliphant as their supervisor and principal. So been able to help folks from various parts of the county.
Okay, now I want to get to the juicy stuff because I'm sure people want to know. You've been a funeral director for 30 years in the business. What are the craziest stories or scenes that have unfolded at the funerals you've been at as a funeral director?
So
craziest things people said. I gotta hear it.
So there's a number of things that kind of come to mind, and early on in my career, one that kind of stuck out at me because, again, I'm 24 years old, new in the business, not a lot of human experience. I remember there was an individual who had been incarcerated in the Lackawanna County Jail and was associated with our funeral home. The family had used us for many years, and there was a daughter who lived in California. And there was no opportunity for her to see her dad, no opportunity to truly memorialize or grieve his death. She had asked us to make a death mask. So plaster of Paris, gauze. So I remember spending hours, applying Vaseline to his hair and applying a gauze wrap to his face, allowing it time to dry, wrapping it up, boxing it up and sending it to her, along with some lockets of hair and some other items and some things like that for her to remember him by, because she didn't have an opportunity to see him in many, many years.
And that was an unusual request for you.
That was, and again, 30 years in the business, that's the only time I was ever asked to do that.
But come on, I mean, like, people, I always hear funerals and weddings bring out sometimes the worst and the best.
Sometimes bring out the worst, and a lot of times you don't consider conflict within families. And I had one particular experience where, at the end of the arrangement conference, so at the end of making the funeral arrangements and setting the viewing and the funeral service and picking out the casket, one of the family members kind of pulled me aside away from the rest of the family and said, "Hey, listen, we kind of have an outlaw in the family. We have someone that we don't want coming to the funeral home." And it was a daughter of the deceased. I guess she had taken a path the family wasn't too thrilled with. And the issue is, funeral homes are public spaces, and we can't keep people from coming to a funeral or to the funeral home. So I had suggested that I designate a family member to be positioned at the door, so that if this person showed up, they went so far as to show me a photograph of the person. Like, if she shows up, please don't let her in the funeral home.
Did she show up?
She did show up. The family member escorted them into we had a little, back then, smoking lounge. You can imagine that. And they took her in there, had a brief chat with her. And what eventually happened at my suggestion was bring her back in after the viewing is concluded. She could pay her respects and she could leave. So that's kind of how that played out.
Yeah. So how do you handle these disagreements or conflicts when they show up with families?
So when dealing with disagreements is, when you first meet with families, you kind of see there's a bit of a hierarchy, especially if there's more than one person coming to make arrangements. So you tend to lean on that individual because they're the one that's making the decisions. So you kind of let that play out a little bit, but then you give the family sort of parameters as to what is and isn't, not so much socially acceptable, but what's going to make things go seamlessly. And obviously there have been conflicts, and you kind of sidebar them and take people aside and have conversations with them because again, let's think about funeral service. It's the worst of times. Emotions are very, very high. And there's a lot of guilt associated sometimes. There's some family members that move out of town. So let's say there's 2 or 3 siblings. One decided to stay local and 2 moved out of town and only saw mom or dad a couple times. Now they're as involved in the process as the person that was in the trenches every single day. So there's sometimes conflict with that. So I always tend to lean on the individual that I see rises above and is making the decisions for the family, and sort of lean on them a little bit to maybe help guide the family or get information from them.
I think the craziest thing that people don't realize, because I've met a number of funeral directors over the years, right?
Sure.
You guys are 24/7.
And that's part of the stress of the job. So there really never is a break. And that's why earlier in the interview you said I'm associated with many funeral homes. It's nice to have a village behind you that you're able to have people to help. Because again, it's not easy to take vacation. It's not easy to go away. Again, there's plenty of soccer games and track meets that I missed because I was working.
For your kids, right?
Right. When I first became a funeral director, I believe it was 1997, my family made a funny joke. They took my picture and taped it to the dining room chair because I missed Christmas Eve dinner and I missed Christmas morning. Over the course of a 24-hour period, I had maybe been serving 5 or 6 families. So think about the emotion associated with having a death around Christmas. But then from the funeral director's perspective, you're not around. So it is a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week business. And that's just the nature of it. So to be able to provide adequate services, you have to make yourself available all the time.
How do you then, as a funeral director, process that emotionally for yourself, right? Because you're dealing with death all the time.
Right.
Emotional families. Calls at 2, 3 in the morning, right? To retrieve the deceased. How do you handle that?
I think it's, when I decided to become a funeral director, I knew that this was something that I wanted to do because I wanted to help people. And the emotional piece of it, obviously I have hobbies. I love to cook. I love to run. I think running is one of those things that takes me out of that space. So if I do have a bad day, I go home, I get out of my clothes, I immediately put my running shoes on and I go for a run. And it does help clear my head because I tend to be a little bit of a process, purpose, payoff type of a person. But now you throw that emotional piece in, and I'm dealing with a family who's lost a young child or a loved one. And I have at the time I had young children myself. And you have to separate that because, again, you're there to help guide the people through the process.
Why are funerals so expensive? That's something people often say.
I think the piece of it that's important to remember is that there's time involved. So there's hours of work sort of behind the scenes that are involved, because when we think about it, you have to think about that block of time that you're dedicating to that family. So for instance, if you have a death on a Sunday and you're meeting the family either Sunday evening or Monday, and you're planning the funeral for that following Friday, every day within the course of that week is involved in planning the funeral, composing the obituary, preparing the body, coordinating folks, flowers, the luncheon. So it's a very time-intensive piece of it. And that question does come up a lot with families. And the understanding is, listen, you have us at your beck and call 24 hours a day for that period of time. The increased cost in merchandise, caskets, vaults.
Yeah, caskets are so expensive. What's up with that?
And I think it's just manufacturing, the price of steel, the price of labor, that all kind of increases the cost. So back in the 80s, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, did get involved and said, hey, listen, we need to regulate this business a little bit. So what they did was they separated out services from merchandise. So you can't tie in your services associated with a certain type of a casket that a family chooses. And again, we can get into the whole cremation piece because that has
I'm going to come to
increased
that next.
over time. Definitely worth mentioning, but I think, again, it's the manufacturing, it's the process of making the caskets, and the shipping. Again, fuel costs being increased. We've seen fuel surcharges on merchandise go up. So unfortunately, things are progressively getting more expensive as time goes on.
And with that being said, you touched on cremations. It seems like they are becoming more popular nationwide.
Right.
Why do you think
absolutely.
that is? Is it because of the cost of the funeral, or because maybe people want to take those ashes and put them in a special place?
So let's think about a couple different things. We are a transient society now, but even when we weren't, I think it simplified things for people because, again, early in the interview, we talked about the process of funerals. It's overwhelming for people sometimes. So when they think about cremation, it seems to be a simpler, more compact way of disposition. And I like to separate it out in saying that cremation isn't necessarily a way to memorializing someone. It's a means of disposition or burial of the individual. So you can still have a traditional funeral where there is a casket, there is a viewing and a church service or a service in a funeral home, followed by cremation. And what that does is it increases the opportunity for family now to take their jewelry is a big thing now, where ashes are placed in small little pieces of jewelry, and each family member can have a piece of mom, dad, Mary, or whoever it may be. So I think that that's an important piece for families. And of course, since COVID, there were many, many restrictions placed on funeral homes during COVID. So you couldn't have more than 2 or 3 people at a time in a funeral home. Even so, the Diocese of Scranton, more regionally, the bishop was forbidding priests to have any type of indoor service. So a lot of our services were being conducted outside at cemeteries. Many funeral homes were not even embalming individuals. So families were sort of pushed into, or cremation was more of a suggestion, and families would go with it. And so it simplified things a little bit. I think nationwide, we're probably sitting right now at a little over 60% cremation. But that, again, regionally is higher. In California, it's a little higher than it is, let's say, in Pennsylvania. But again, I want to remind folks that cremation isn't necessarily a means of memorializing. It's a means of disposition. So you could still have every other piece of the funeral, and then at the end, the person is cremated and buried, or perhaps on the mantle in your home.
And what's the percentage right now?
About 60%.
60% of people
60%.
choosing cremation.
Right. Some form of cremation. And we separate cremation out into direct cremation, which is the removal from the place of death, cremation's performed, and the ashes are returned to the family. So that would be a direct cremation. A cremation with memorial service is another sort of level of cremation, and then obviously a traditional funeral with cremation. So it's kind of a misnomer to say that there's traditional and there's cremation. The lines have kind of blurred over time. And even post-COVID, many families still choose to have cremation. I think average, a family will deal with the death once every 7 years, just to put a perspective on it. So again, it's not something you do all the time.
Once every 7 years.
That's about average. And again, that's extended families. So that could be a grandparent, could be a child, it could be a cousin, or whatever. But about once every 7 years.
So you mentioned COVID and the restrictions and everything. What did you see during COVID? Huge uptick in deaths, or pretty much the same?
So that first year, refresh my memory, 2020 into 2021, right? It's a blur. It's amazing. It's been 4 years now. Definitely an uptick. As I polled or spoke to other funeral directors that I work with, there was probably a 10 to 15% increase in that year of deaths, as we saw nursing homes saw the largest uptick in deaths. And another thing that we saw that's interesting was the use of social media and the use of technology associated with funeral services. Since we weren't able to get together, Facebook Live was a really big tool that we used to get memorial services and funeral services out to the general public. Instagram. So
you touch on all the digital components, right? Has that made funerals a little less personal? Because I see people leave condolences on Facebook, right? How has that kind of changed the game?
I think what it does is it does two things. Maybe it tends to make it a little less personal because people say, oh, I'll just send a Facebook condolence, or I'll go on legacy.com, which drives a lot of the electronic piece of it, where they post obituaries on legacy.com. I'll just leave a condolence there and I won't go. So perhaps there's a little bit of a downtick in people going to funerals. I don't know if it necessarily makes it less personalized, but it's definitely a vehicle where funerals can be, get out there into the interweb, so to say.
And I don't want to creep you out, but we were talking about cremations, and you have to tell me as a funeral director if you think this is weird. I always say, heaven forbid if something happens to me. Right. I want to be cremated, have a celebration of life, and I want everyone to get like a little steel Dixie cup of me, and you get to take me home.
Right. Well, obviously, like I had mentioned before,
Would you find that as a weird request, or you're
no, not at all.
Because you mentioned people putting their ashes in jewelry, but I'd be like, here, everyone gets a little piece.
Absolutely. And then they can do exactly what I had a family recently that asked for some of the ashes separate from the urn that was to be buried. And again, Amazon has become a big part of everyone's life. You know what I mean? You probably have a couple packages waiting for you when you get home tonight. But Amazon is a great resource for urns, scattering urns, cremation jewelry. All you need to do is type in cremation urn in a Amazon search, and you can sit there for days, pages and pages of urns, pages and pages of jewelry. So it's not an unusual request, and something that people are becoming more and more attuned to hearing and more attuned to doing. So it does allow people to have a little piece of that person.
Are there rules or laws on like where you can scatter people's ashes, whether it's in Pennsylvania, nationally? Because I've seen people travel with grandma's ashes back to Ireland and sprinkle them.
Right, and I think so. So let's take that into a couple different steps. Yes, there are. So let's say, for instance, a state park or a national park like Yellowstone. I would suggest that families get in touch with the necessary officials at those parks to find out what their rules are. At least at minimum, let them know this is what you're doing. If it's private land, if it's on your own property, there's absolutely no problem with scattering it. One thing that I've done many, many times is perhaps the person was a golfer and they want their ashes scattered in a sand trap or along a course. As long as you let the superintendent of the golf course know, or the park ranger know that that's something you're going to be doing, you don't really get too much pushback. Another thing that's very popular is out of an airplane. I remember when I first got into the business, the owner of the funeral home owned an airplane and was a pilot, and would scatter ashes over the person's favorite island or over the person's favorite park or golf course. So I would say, if it's a state park or a federally owned land or someone's private property, you seek their permission before doing something like that, but there aren't any specific laws that say you can't do that.
And Vince, what about unusual burial requests? Like, as a family come to you and be like, hey, Grandpa Tom wants to be buried with his rifle,
Right.
his dog, which passed away, and we ended up embalming the dog. Like, what are the weirdest ones?
So a lot of times we not specifically provide cremation services for pets, but a lot of family members will come in with cremated pets. I know my neighbor's dad passed away recently, and they had the dog's ashes mixed, commingled in with his ashes. So a lot of requests for pets, and many times cigarettes are a huge thing. Money, just in case they need to for a parking meter, or a specific outfit that the individual always loved to wear. But those are usually pretty for what I would, maybe the general public doesn't see that as normal, but something that is sort of done on a regular basis. I've never, buried someone with a rifle or a gun, but certainly something if someone asked and it's within reason and it certainly doesn't break any laws, there's no problem with doing that.
And I'm sure you guys, like every business, right? You have to keep up on stuff, learn what's coming out with funerals, or the latest and greatest in caskets or cremations.
Absolutely.
Do funeral directors, or just people who work at a funeral home, do you guys have like massive conventions in the country where you go there and like, what happens? Walk me through that. Like,
right. So it's been some time since I've been to so the National Funeral Directors Association obviously is our national organization. Pennsylvania Funeral Directors Association is our state association, and then we have in this particular county, Lackawanna County Funeral Directors Association. So it's a way for folks to kind of get together, whether it's economies of scale, where you're in a room and you're able to talk to colleagues in the profession and find out what they're doing, or to try to collaborate with them. On a national level, some of the organizations that will be at these meetings are casket manufacturers, hearse manufacturers, fluid manufacturers. So you're learning about new and innovative features or products that are available in the funeral industry. Like any other industry, things do change, families' needs change. So we're able to get together as a group of professionals and chat about what's changed in the industry. Again, there could be like social media presence there as well, because again, that's becoming a big part of it. Because let's think about, do you have a subscription to the local newspaper? We're seeing the print kind of move away, and it's moving more to electronic. So many people get their obituaries online. The first thing family members will ask is, what's your website? Do you put the obituary on the website? Can you send me the obituary electronically so I could post it on my Facebook? So obviously that's become a larger part of the business.
And we talk about social media, right? And how people are sharing their condolences online. I've been at funerals and stuff, and is this normal? I've seen people take selfies with the dead person.
So,
I mean, it's weird, but I've seen it. Like, have you seen that a lot?
And again, I've been in the industry for 30 years. The thought of me in the late 90s, early 2000s, even taking a picture of someone in a casket was like, never thought. And again, the iPhone came out in 2007. So, a lot of my early career, phones didn't take pictures. You actually had to have a digital camera or a Polaroid or a camera that you would take to CVS, get the pictures developed, and you got them 2 days later. Now, because people are so transient and not able to come to viewings, people will video the entire funeral or take a lot of pictures of the deceased. So I just think as societies change and norms change and expectations change, so too the funeral business has to change. So I see it all the time. There's invariably someone in the viewing room or in the church that's holding an iPad or holding a phone, videotaping the entire funeral for someone perhaps who was not able to be there. And like I said, during COVID, that was a big piece of it, where we would set up an iPad or an iPhone to video the entire
And it was
service.
like Facebook Live.
Facebook Live was huge, yeah, absolutely. And YouTube.
I think of funerals, right, and flowers everywhere. And I know a lot of times flowers after a funeral, they get donated to nursing homes. Do you find that, like, some people might think that's morbid, right?
Well, again,
or is that like, that's normal?
It's commonplace, because again, we have to think about cemeteries not allowing more than 3 or 4 pieces of flowers at a grave. Or let's think about a cremation where you're now taking mom or dad's ashes home and you have 30 pieces of flowers. Not many people want to take big mache pieces or big ferns home for the flowers to disintegrate. So yes, there was many years ago a large move to take flowers to nursing homes, but now they don't have the staff available to kind of break those apart and make smaller pieces. We still do it to a degree, but not as much. Because again, what's that conversation look like in a nursing home? Well, these flowers came from a funeral.
So what do you do now? Like toss them out, or people take
So
them?
what we do is we do toss them out. And we find a lot of times at cemeteries, they have dumpsters there. And as we pull into the cemetery, we're allowed, in some cases, to dump them in the dumpster.
At what age do you think people should plan for their funeral? Thinking burial plots, arrangements. I mean, it's a tough conversation for people to have, especially if they're 30, early 40s.
And it does depend on the individual, okay? If they're comfortable having the conversation, I would say as you start to pick up the newspaper and see your contemporaries passing away, people start thinking about that, but it's like now taking that next step. And what's important is having that conversation with your family members. A lot of people say, oh, it's in my will. Well, the will is read 3-4 weeks, a month after the person dies. So I think it's having conversations. So back to your question, I would say there's no set age. So you're in your 40s, you're in your 50s, you start having that conversation if you have children or with your loved one, your partner, your wife, your husband, whoever it might be. And having a real conversation, not a joking, haha, if I die type conversation, but hey, listen, I've had this conversation with my children. Like, this is what I want done. And so it alleviates that sort of decision making. And I'll tell a really quick story. My mom and dad came to this country in the late 50s. And my dad had a really strong tie to his homeland. They came from Italy. And
because I think you told me you didn't even speak English until you were in kindergarten, right?
Well, yeah,
like,
right. So
Italian was your first language.
Italian was, exactly. And I pushed back quite a bit. I didn't want to speak English because I didn't want to conform. But I remember one day walking home and my mom basically told me, listen, you're going back to school tomorrow, you're going to speak English or it's over. You know what I mean? We're going to homeschool you or you're not going back to school. So, but my parents came in the late 50s and my dad had a real love because, again, he left all of his siblings, his mom in Italy. My mom and her sister came to this country, settled here. Her parents eventually came. And so my dad always said, I want to go back to Italy. I want to go back to Italy. And it ties into your question. Back in 2013, my father was battling some bladder issues, some bladder cancer. And I remember him setting an appointment to go see his doctor. And the appointment was on a Friday. And I remember that earlier in that week, I think it was like Tuesday, he said, hey, Vince, I want you to come down to the house. I have something to show you. And again, let's remember, he wanted to be buried in Italy, send me back. I don't want to stay in the United States. So I get to their house, and he has a manila envelope on the kitchen table. So I open it up, and it's a mausoleum. I'm like, what am I looking at here? It was show and tell? He said, I bought that. I said, okay. We're going tomorrow. We're going to XYZ cemetery. We're going to pick out a plot. So-and-so is building this for me right now.
Here in Pennsylvania.
Here in Pennsylvania. He said, I want to be buried here. I'm like, it's a brief conversation about it. So you don't want to, your mother wants to, stay here, et cetera, et cetera.
How does that even happen, though, if somebody wants to get shipped back?
So that's a whole thing. It isn't something I've personally done, but you do have to have the consulate involved. There is a lead-lined casket that's used. It's soldered. It's sealed.
Wow.
And so it's a lengthy process, a lot of meetings and things like that. And obviously that's something you're going to want to escort your loved one back to their homeland. So not only is it time consuming, but it's costly. And we were prepared to do that for my dad. This is what he wanted. The last thing you want to do is not, live out someone's wishes and follow their wants. So the end result of this story was we went to the cemetery that Friday, selected the graves. He had his procedure, and he was dead on Sunday. He passed away that Sunday from something unrelated. He had some heart issues and things like that. But let's think about this for a minute. Had he not done that on Tuesday or decided he wanted to be here, showed me and my sisters and my mom that this is what he wanted, most likely we would have gone through the process of sending him back to be buried with his parents and his siblings in Italy. So I think it's important to have that conversation. Number one, come to a decision as to what you want and be at peace with that, but then sharing that with your family, because again, it could avoid a conflict. You asked me earlier in the interview, are there disagreements and things? I think if the person lets their wishes known, then there's no question and there's no conflict in the end. That's what mom wanted, that's what dad wanted. And you follow those wishes and you could rest easy knowing that you did what the person wanted.
So as a funeral director for more than 3 decades, have you planned your funeral? And shared the wishes with your family?
In my mind, I have, absolutely. So I have 2 sons. I have had that conversation with them. I had the conversation with their mom. Not so much with my mother in my immediate family, because my mom's very traditional. And I mean, cremation is something that I'm kind of leaning toward, but definitely something that I've told my children that this is the way I want it to go, and this is kind of where I want my funeral plans to be. So, and hopefully they'll follow those wishes.
Just a few minutes ago, you talked about when it comes to planning your funeral, right? Sometimes when people start seeing people they grew up with, right, passing away, then they get that on their mind. Okay, I need to start planning my funeral.
Right.
Have you buried anyone you went to high school with? And if so, what was that like?
So I have. Early in my career, sort of a tragic situation. I had been a new funeral director, was on call over the weekend, and had gotten a call from the local coroner. And the twist to the story was it was a murder-suicide. So the individual had been seeing this person, and there was a breakup involved. Person didn't take it well, shot the individual. Had made a couple phone calls between shooting the person and then taking their own life. So now people know what's going on, know the location, and converge on the scene and find these 2 individuals in a car. So took the call from the local coroner, quickly get into funeral director mode, go to the coroner's office. And it's interesting because the funeral home I worked at the time had 2 locations. One in Scranton and one outside of the city. And the added twist to the story is I was handling the funeral for both families. So that was an interesting thing in and of itself. And so I get both of the remains to the funeral home. I'm in the embalming room, and I'm just kind of setting things up a little bit, and I start to unzip the bag. And I'm getting the person ready to embalm them, and I take a really good look, and I knew the name, but you're kind of in the throes of things, and your mind's not processing the words. You've probably been in that situation, and I take a look at this person. I'm like, I went to high school with this person, and I graduated high school in '88. This was '97, so it was only about 9 years later. And that really struck me like, wow, this is someone that's my age. The time I was 27 years old. Life ahead of me, life ahead of him. So it was pretty traumatizing. I knew the parents, I knew the brother. And I guess the silver lining to this is that someone that this person knew was handling their funeral. So it gave the family some sort of solace and some sort of comfort knowing that, and I was able to share stories about him from high school and things like that. So certainly didn't make it any better, but it sort of eased their burden a little bit.
And I think of your story, you're saying you were like in your late 20s when all this went down. And you've grown up, your kids are growing up. Funeral homes seem like a family business.
Right.
Did you have any interest from your kids saying, okay, I want to go into this, I want to get into the biz? Because I've seen that with families, right? Especially in northeastern and central Pennsylvania.
Sure, absolutely.
Names are everywhere. They're not franchised like in big cities, or you know what I mean? Like they're just...
Exactly. Neither of my boys, obviously I took them around the funeral home a little bit. I had to run down and pick something up.
What did they think about that when, as dad, as an undertaker?
I think you reach a certain age in life, and my kids are in their 20s now, where you're cool again. So I think for them now, it's kind kind of cool. When they were younger and growing up in it, it was kind of a morbid thing and they really didn't want anything to do with it. But as they matured and as they aged and had conversations with their friends around them, they thought it was kind of cool. And I had my kids help me a couple times on funerals, not too much, because again, the time involved and truly the payoff to it, I sort of maybe am not pushing them to get into the business, but certainly not pushing them away from it. But they kind of think at this point it's kind of cool that dad is able to help people in the worst of times.
And we think of the funeral home business in general, and everybody says things are so expensive. Is it a lucrative business? Because, I mean, it's job security.
Well, it is job security, and cremation's becoming more and more a part of it and is more economical. When we talk about lucrative, there's a time element that's involved that if you made this amount of money in any other job, I think you could look at the work-life balance of it, because there's very little work-life balance in this. And so I don't know if lucrative is a word, but I think it's sustaining and it is a good living. And I think that you certainly command a certain level of respect from the community providing this service to families.
Let's talk about overdose deaths, right? There's such a drug problem facing America now.
Sure.
What have you noticed with overdose deaths just in northeastern Pennsylvania alone over the past several years? Has there been an uptick? Are we coming down?
I think that in just looking at the statistics recently, I think in our county specifically, we average probably around 70 to 75 overdose deaths a year. And I think there's more of an awareness to overdose deaths because of fentanyl. I think heroin, and various other illicit drugs that people are using, there's more of an awareness to that. And now I understand that if you supply a lethal dose of whether it's fentanyl or heroin or cocaine to an individual, you could be charged with murder. So I think there's more of an awareness around it. And I think families are sort of removing that stigma, if you will. Whereas before in obituaries, there would be no mention of any form of an addiction. If you pick up the newspaper now, you will see, and I've written my share of obituaries where the person died from an overdose, and they'll mention it right in the obituary and make it known to the family. And a lot of times when it's an open casket, it's like that is the face of overdose right there. And the thing that's a misnomer also is that we think maybe it affects only people in their 20s or teenagers. No. We've seen folks in their 40s, 50s, and 60s die of overdose. Because when we think about it, a lot of folks that become addicted to these types of oxycodone, Percocets, Dilaudid, things like that, and move to heroin, number one, because it's cheaper, because perhaps they had a car accident or an accident at work. You're in your 40s, your 50s, you think you're Superman, you lift something, you strain your back, all of a sudden you have back surgery. And now you become addicted to these pain medications. And there's an awareness to that now. So physicians are not as susceptible to over-prescribing or prescribing at all. Many of these patients are referred to pain doctors. So now you become addicted to these pain pills and all of a sudden you get cut off. So now what do I do? Where am I going to go? What am I going to turn to? You turn to the cheap alternative, which is heroin or some other drug, and you become addicted to it. And this is where fentanyl kind of sneaks, is because fentanyl is even cheaper than heroin. You get a bad dose, and unfortunately, that's the person's demise. So I say that it's pretty much leveled off in and around in this regional area in the 70s, but there's more of a public awareness to it, definitely.
How tough are those funerals, especially if the person who overdosed is so young, with the families? I'm sure all funerals are difficult, right, for families.
So
but
if we think about what the family's dealing with leading up to that, every time the phone rings, every time the person leaves the house, it might be the last time. So it's a mental strain, it's a physical strain, it's getting phone calls from the person that, they're at their wit's end, they're at the end. And I think it's a strain in that regard. So it's a stressful, taxing life. And there are a lot of treatment facilities where people can go to get help, but they have to want to have that help. And I think from a funeral director's perspective, there are no words that we can lead with that are going to make the family feel any better. We can make the process of the funeral easier and ease their burden in that regard. But I think it's understanding that that person loved them and that they were trying their best. And what we need to understand if we're talking about overdoses is it's a disease like diabetes, like heart disease. There isn't, quote, something wrong with the person. So that's lifting that stigma from it. So do we think about it the same way when someone dies from a heart attack or from a complication of diabetes? Not necessarily, because we don't view that person as being wrong or broken. We look at a person that overdosed in that way, but I think it's understanding that, you know, this is a disease and the person tried their best and they're off to a better place.
How has working with the dead for more than 30 years impacted your life?
I think it's not taking anything for granted and truly living in the moment. And I think it's affected the personal relationships I have with people that I don't take those for granted. But at the same time, it's those people that take your peace and your energy from you. It's, you know, kind of like sliding them out of your life a little bit and surrounding yourself with good people and sharing good energy with folks. I think that's kind of, if I'm going to look back at 30 years of dealing in this business, it's surrounding yourself with good people and trying to get every bit of good out of life as opposed to focusing on the negative.
And probably realizing, because you've dealt with this with families, that things could change like that. And
In
the
the
person,
blink-
as you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, says goodbye to you in the morning, you might not see them.
They might not come
ever
home.
again.
And it could be a 3-year-old or a 90-year-old. And it doesn't matter what age it is. People grieve in their own way. And I think the message is that you need to feel it. So whatever you're feeling, it's not wrong, it's not right. It's almost like an anxiety attack. You let those feelings take you over. Because if you don't, they're going to linger. So cry, scream, go for a ride, do what you love, and never take anything for granted.
Any final thoughts? Vince Maletta, a funeral director for 30 years in northeastern Pennsylvania. I think this was fascinating. So much of what you touched on, eye-opening, and I think we all are saying to ourselves all the time, you know, life can change in a matter of seconds, right? But we don't really live it sometimes, right?
And it's tough to in the moment because we have so much day to day.
Yeah.
We don't tend to want to live in the moment because we're worried about what we're doing tomorrow. And if I'm going to leave you with one thought, I don't think anyone ever laid on their deathbed and said, I wish I worked more. Right? I think people probably look back and say, I wish I took that trip. I wish I hugged my loved one more. I wish I told someone I loved them more. Never did I work. I should have worked more. I should have took that other job. So I think that's the message that I think if anyone's going to take anything from this, it's live your life to the fullest.
All right. Vince Maletta, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. This was eye-opening.
Appreciate this time. Thank you
All
so
right.
much.
And I appreciate you for being a part of another episode of The Ryan Leckey Show. I'll see you next time.
Here we go, buddy.